Hello, my friend. Today I bring you another lost legend from the depths of Middle-earth. Close your eyes, feel the magic surround you. Our journey begins. In the days when the Third Age grew long and weary, when the glory of Gil-galad had faded into song and the kingdoms of men had dwindled to scattered realms, there came a darkness creeping from the east. It was not the bold advance of armies, nor the thunder of war drums that first heralded this shadow, but rather a silence, deep and unnatural, that began to spread through the wild lands beyond the misty mountains. The Eldar felt it first, as they feel all things that touch the song of creation. In Rivendell, Lord Elrond would pause in his reading of ancient texts, his grey eyes turning eastward with a weight of memory and foreboding. In the Golden Wood, Galadriel's mirror showed troubled waters, and she would speak in whispers to the Malin trees, asking what winds brought such unease from the southern reaches of Mirkwood. But it was Gandalf the Grey who first gave name to this growing dread. The wizard had wandered long in those days, walking roads both bright and dim, and his staff had tapped upon stone and earth from the grey havens to the borders of Mordor. In the autumn of the year that would later be marked as the beginning of the Shadow's return, he stood upon the high pass and gazed southward toward the dark fortress that men called Dol Guldur, the Hill of Sorcery. There, where the mountains bent toward the forest, like ancient fingers clutching at green shadow, something stirred. Not the stirring of beast or bird, for all such creatures had long since fled that accursed place, but the stirring of a will, cold and patient and filled with malice beyond mortal understanding. The very stones seemed to whisper of it, and the wind that blew from those heights carried no scent of pine or earth, but only the dry breath of tombs long sealed. Gandalf pulled his grey cloak tighter about his shoulders, though the cold he felt came not from the mountain air, but from a deeper source. He had walked in the shadows of the First Age, had seen the light of the two trees, and witnessed their dimming. He knew the taste of evil when it stirred, knew the weight of ancient malice when it began to wake from slumber. And now, in this lengthening of days, he felt that weight settling upon the world like dust upon a forgotten grave. The peoples of Middle-earth went about their daily lives, tending their fields and flocks, raising their children, and telling their tales by firelight, unaware that in the dark places of the world, old hatred was remembering its strength. In the Shire, hobbits prepared for harvest with cheerful industry. In Bree, men spoke of weather and trade. In the halls of Thranduil, the woodland elves sang songs of starlight and growing things. But beneath the surface of these peaceful days, like a current deep beneath still water, the shadow was spreading, for the Dark Lord was stirring. Not yet in his true form. That day would come later, when the ring he had lost would call to him with growing urgency. But in spirit and will, he was awakening. From the ruins of Barad-dûr, his malice reached out like black fingers across the leagues, seeking, testing, remembering. And in Dol Guldur, ancient and accursed, he began to gather his strength once more. The necromancer, they would call him in days to come, though Gandalf already suspected the truth that lay beneath that name. For he had fought this enemy before in the glory of Gil-galad's host, and he knew that evil of such magnitude did not simply fade away. It waited, it planned, It prepared for its hour to come again. As the first snows began to fall upon the high pass, Gandalf turned his face westward toward Rivendell, his mind heavy with the weight of knowledge and the burden of choice. Soon, very soon, the White Council would need to be summoned. Soon the wise would need to take counsel together, for the Shadow was no longer content to merely brood in its fortress of stone and spell. The Third Age was drawing toward its great testing, though few yet knew it. And in the growing darkness, only the light of courage and wisdom would suffice to guide the free peoples through the trials that lay ahead. The borders of Mirkwood had grown strange in those days, stranger even than the darkness that dwelt within its heart. Where once the great forest had been called Greenwood the Great, and elven halls had rung with music beneath its boughs, now there lingered only shadow and silence. Yet it was not the deep silence of peace, but the watchful quiet of things that dare not speak. Thranduil's guards rode the outer paths with increasing unease, for the very trees seemed to lean inward, as if listening to voices that came from the forest's heart. The great beeches and oaks that had stood sentinel for age upon age now groaned without wind, and their leaves, even in the fullness of summer, carried the pale cast of things grown in darkness. It was on such a morning, when mist hung low between the tree trunks and the sun seemed loath to penetrate the canopy, that young Legolas rode the border paths with a company of his father's warriors. Fair he was, even among the Eldar, with hair like captured starlight and eyes that held the memory of ancient springs. Yet on this day, his usual joy in the wild places was clouded, for he too felt the wrongness that crept through root and branch. They had ridden since dawn along the old elf path that skirted the forest's eastern edge, where Mirkwood pressed close against the running waters of the river running. Here, where the trees should have given way to open meadows, the forest had begun to encroach, sending forth twisted saplings and creeping vines that choked the grass and turned clear streams to brackish pools. "My lord," spoke Galion, eldest of the company and long in the service of the woodland realm. "The trees grow restless. Listen, do you hear it?" Legolas drew rein and tilted his head, his keen ears catching what mortal senses could never perceive. There, beneath the ordinary sounds of wind and water, beneath even the deep breathing of the ancient wood, came something else, a whisper, soft as the rustle of dry leaves, yet carrying words in a tongue that should not be spoken beneath sun or star. Ash Nazg Dubatuluk, Ash Nazg Gimbatul. The words faded even as Legolas strained to hear them, leaving only an echo of malice that seemed to hang in the air like smoke. His horse shied, white-eyed with fear, and even the seasoned warriors of his company grew pale and reached instinctively for their sword hilts. "Riders approach," said Galion suddenly, his voice tight with concern, "from the south, and they ride in haste." Through the mist came the sound of hoofbeats, urgent and desperate, and soon they could see a small company of men spurring their weary mounts along the old road. Their clothes were torn and stained with travel, and their faces bore the hollow look of those who have seen things better left forgotten. The leader, a tall man with grey in his beard and a sword across his knees, called out as he drew near, "My lords of the woodland realm, I bring word from Dale, and tidings that should reach the ears of all who love the light." Legolas rode forward, his hand raised in greeting, but his bearing wary. "Speak then, son of men. What news do you carry that drives you so hard upon our borders?" "My name is Bard, and I serve as captain of the guard in Dale," the man replied, his breath coming in gasps. 3 days passed. Strange lights were seen in the south, beyond the long lake. Green fire dancing upon the water, and shapes moving in the darkness that fled when our torches drew near. "But that is not the worst of it, my lord." He paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the morning chill. "Yesterday at dawn, fishermen found bodies on the shore, men of the lake town who had vanished a fortnight ago. But they were changed. Their eyes held no light of life, yet they moved and spoke, calling out in voices we knew, begging us to come to them beneath the water." A silence fell upon the company, heavy as stone. The horses stamped and snorted, sensing their riders' unease, and from the deep forest came the distant cry of some bird. Or perhaps it was no bird at all, but something else that had learned to mimic the voices of living things. "You speak of the necromancer's work," Legolas said at last, his voice low and troubled. "The evil that dwells in Dol Guldur reaches out with longer fingers than before." Bard nodded grimly. "So we feared. But there is more, my lord. The dwarves of the Lonely Mountain have sent word. Strange tremors shake the earth, and deep fires burn in places where no flame should be. And strangest of all, the great dragon Smaug has not been seen for many days. His fires no longer light the mountain's peak, and some say they have heard his voice calling out in the night, not in rage as before, but in fear." The whisper came again then, carried on a wind that touched no leaf but seemed to pass through the Shorken very air itself. This time all could hear it, mortal and immortal alike, speaking words of binding and dominion in the black speech of Mordor, and with it came a certainty that settled upon them like a shroud. The time of small evils and quiet malice was passing. Something far greater was stirring, something that had been bound but now sought to break free. Legolas looked eastward toward the hidden fortress where shadow dwelt, then south toward the lonely mountain where dragon fire had grown dim. The pieces of some vast and terrible pattern were moving, though their ultimate design remained hidden. But one thing was clear: the peace of recent years was ending, and Middle-earth would soon have need of all its defenders. "Ride swift to my father," he commanded Galion. "Tell him what we have heard, and bid him send word to Rivendell. Lord Elrond must know that the necromancer's power grows, and that the time may soon come when the wise must take counsel together." As the elven warriors spurred their horses toward the halls of Thranduil, and Bard's company continued their desperate ride toward whatever aid they might find, the whisper in the trees grew stronger, and the very roots of Mirkwood trembled with the weight of awakening evil. Far to the west, where the last homely house lay hidden in its valley of singing waters, Gandalf the Grey stood upon the bridge of Rivendell and watched the stars wheel overhead. The night was clear, yet to his eyes, which had looked upon the light of Valinor in days long past, the very air seemed tainted with shadow. Behind him, the house of Elrond glowed with warm light, and he could hear the soft voices of the Eldar raised in evening song. But even that ancient music seemed muted now, as if the darkness pressing in from the east could dim even the memory of the undying lands. A soft footfall upon stone announced Elrond's approach, and the grey wizard turned to greet the Lord of Rivendell. Tall and noble stood the half-elven, his dark hair touched with silver, and his grey eyes holding depths of wisdom gathered through long ages. Yet Gandalf could see the weight of care upon his friend's features, the shadow of foreknowledge that had begun to trouble all the wise in these latter days. "The messages have come," Elrond said, without preamble, his voice carrying the gravity of deep waters. "From Thranduil in the north, from the rangers in the wild, from the Dunedain who watch the borders of old Arnor. All speak of the same thing, a stirring in the dark places, a voice that whispers where no voice should be." Gandalf nodded slowly, his weathered hands gripping the stone parapet. "I have felt it too, old friend. The very stones cry out against it, and the wind brings news that makes my heart heavy. The necromancer grows bold, and I fear the time has come when we can no longer hope that he will remain content with shadows and whispers." "You mean to ride south?" Elrond observed, and it was not a question, but a statement born of long friendship and deeper understanding. "I must. Whatever power has made its dwelling in Dol Guldur, it spreads its influence like poison in a well. If we do not act soon, I fear we shall find ourselves facing an enemy far greater than we have prepared for." The wizard's voice was heavy with foreboding, and his grey eyes seemed to look beyond the present moment into futures dark and uncertain. Elrond was silent for a long moment, his gaze turning eastward toward the misty mountains that stood like a wall between the fair valley and the wild lands beyond. "I have looked in the mirror of Galadriel," he said at last, "and in its waters I have seen fire and shadow, the breaking of ancient bonds, and the stirring of things that were better left sleeping. Go then, if you must, but do not go alone into that darkness. Alone I have always walked the paths between light and shadow," Gandalf replied with a slight smile that held no warmth. "It is the burden of my kind, to stand watch in the places where others fear to tread. But I will be careful, Elrond. The darkness is cunning, and I sense that it has been preparing for this moment far longer than we have known." With the dawn, the Grey Wizard took his leave of Rivendell, riding out from the hidden valley as the sun painted the eastern peaks with gold. His horse was Shadowfax, swiftest of the Miaras, a gift from Rohan that bore him with the speed of wind across hill and dale. But even the great horse seemed to sense the weight of their journey, for as they climbed the winding paths that led from the valley, his ears lay back and his nostrils flared as if scenting some distant fire. The road east was long and lonely, winding through the wild lands where few now dwelt, and fewer still travelled without great need. Here, in the empty spaces between the kingdoms of mortal men, the old paths still held their ancient power, and those with eyes to see could read the history of Middle-earth, written in stone and stream, in the shapes of hills and the courses of rivers. Gandalf rode through valleys where once great cities had stood, now marked only by grass-covered mounds and broken stones that spoke of glory long faded. He passed the ruins of watchtowers, built in the days when Gil-galad held sway over the lands west of the mountains, their crumbling walls still bearing the carved emblems of the last alliance. Each ruin seemed to whisper of endings, of the slow retreat of light before the patient advance of shadow. On the third day of his journey, as he climbed the rising ground that would bring him to the high pass through the misty mountains, a change came over the land. The very air grew thick and oppressive, and Shadowfax began to shy at shapes that only he could see. The grass beneath their feet seemed less green, the flowers fewer, and even the streams that crossed their path ran dark and sullen, as if reluctant to reflect the sky. It was then that Gandalf first heard it, the whisper that had troubled the borders of Mirkwood, now carried on the wind like the distant echo of some dreadful incantation. Words in the black speech, ancient and malevolent, speaking of binding and dominion and the gathering of scattered powers. The wizard's staff blazed suddenly with white light, and the whisper faded, but the silence that followed was worse than the voice itself. "So," Gandalf murmured to the wind, his voice carrying a note of grim resolve, "you know that I come. Good. Let there be no pretense between us, no hiding in shadows and whispers. I am Gandalf the Grey, servant of the secret fire and wielder of the flame of Arnor. If you would test your strength against mine, then let us have done with it in the clean air, not in the corruption of your dark tower." But no answer came save the moaning of the wind through the mountain passes, and Gandalf urged Shadowfax forward into the growing gloom. Behind them, the last light of the west faded into night, and ahead lay only the darkness of the wild lands and the shadow that dwelt in Dol Guldur. The grey wizard rode on through the gathering dark, his staff casting a small circle of light that seemed pitifully small against the vast malice that pressed in from all sides. Yet in that light was power enough to hold back the shadow, and in his heart burned a flame that no darkness could extinguish. For he was one of the Astari, sent from the west to guard against the return of ancient evil, and his time of testing had come at last. On the 7th day of his journey from Rivendell, as the sun climbed pale and reluctant through banks of grey cloud, Gandalf came at last to the borders of southern Mirkwood. Here the great forest pressed close against the feet of the mountains, and the trees grew so thick and dark that even at midday the paths lay shrouded in perpetual twilight. No birds sang in these depths, no small creatures rustled among the fallen leaves, and the very air seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of some dreadful revelation. Shadowfaxer had grown increasingly reluctant as they penetrated deeper into the wildlands, and now the great horse would go no further. His coat was dark with sweat despite the morning chill, and his noble head turned constantly toward the west, as if yearning for the clean winds of Rohan and the familiar sense of home. Gandalf dismounted and laid a gentle hand upon the horse's neck, speaking softly in the tongue of the Rohirrim. "Go then, my friend," he said, his voice heavy with understanding. "This path was never meant for such as you, whose heart knows only the joy of open plains and racing wind. Return to your kindred, and if I do not follow in due time, carry word to those who wait in Edoras that Gandalf the Grey rode into shadow, but did not ride in vain." With a last mournful whinny, Shadowfax turned and galloped away, his hoofbeats fading quickly in the oppressive silence of the forest. Gandalf watched until the last glimpse of grey coat vanished among the trees, then shouldered his pack and set his face toward the south, where the darkness was thickest and the very stones seemed to whisper of ancient malice. The path, if path it could be called, wound through groves of twisted trees whose branches reached out like gnarled fingers to catch a cloak and staff. The bark of these trees was black as charcoal, and their leaves, what few remained even in the height of summer, were sickly yellow, as if touched by some lingering poison. Beneath his feet, the ground was soft with the mulch of countless years, and with each step came the wet squelch of decay and the sweet sick smell of things long dead. As the day wore on, the forest grew ever more oppressive. Strange shapes flitted between the trees just beyond the edge of vision, and more than once, Gandalf caught glimpses of eyes, red as coals, yellow as fever, green as corruption, watching his progress from the shadows. But when he turned his staff toward them and spoke a word of power, they would vanish like smoke, leaving only the echo of mocking laughter that seemed to come from the trees themselves. It was near the hour of sunset, though in that benighted place the sun had not been seen for many leagues, that Gandalf came at last to the edge of a great clearing. Here the trees fell back as if in fear, leaving a circle of blasted heath where nothing grew save a few stunted thorns and patches of grey moss that crumbled to dust at the lightest touch. The air was thick with the reek of sulphur and decay, and in the distance came the sound of dripping water, though whether it was rain or something fouler, the wizard could not tell. And there, rising from the heart of the clearing, like a great black fang thrust up from the earth's corrupted heart, stood Dol Guldur, the hill of dark sorcery. Never in all his long years, not even in the darkest days of the war against Morgoth, had Gandalf beheld such a fortress of evil. Built upon a hill of black stone that seemed to drink in light itself, the tower rose in twisted spirals toward the lowering sky, its walls carved with runes that hurt the eye to look upon and spoke of power used for purposes that would make angels weep. No mortal hand had shaped those stones, nor any craft of dwarf or elf. This was the work of darker artificers, raised by will and malice to be a seat of power for one whose very name was a curse upon the lips of the free peoples. From the tower's crown came a sickly green light that pulsed like a diseased heart, and with each pulse the very air seemed to shiver, and the ground beneath Gandalf's feet trembled, as if the earth itself recoiled from what dwelt within those walls. Windows like empty eye sockets stared out from the tower's face, and from some of them came faint sounds, not the voices of men or elves or any creature of the light, but the whispers of things that should not be, speaking in tongues that predated the coming of the firstborn to Middle-earth. As Gandalf stood at the edge of the clearing, his grey cloak whipping about him in a wind that seemed to blow from all directions at once, he felt the full weight of the malice that dwelt within that accursed place. It pressed upon his mind like a physical thing, seeking to crush his will and turn his thoughts to despair. Visions flashed before his eyes, the destruction of all he held dear, the triumph of shadow over light, the final victory of entropy over the music of creation itself. But the grey wizard was not so easily broken. Setting his staff firmly upon the poisoned ground, he spoke a word of power that rang out across the clearing like the sound of silver bells, and the green light atop the tower flickered and dimmed. For a moment, blessed silence fell over the blasted heath, and in that silence, Gandalf heard something that made his heart leap with sudden hope. The sound of a voice, faint and far off, calling out in the tongue of the Eldar. Someone was imprisoned within that tower of evil, someone who still retained enough of their true nature to speak in the language of the light. And in that moment, Gandalf knew that his long journey had not been in vain, for here was a chance to strike a blow against the growing darkness, to rescue one who might hold the key to understanding the true nature of the threat that was gathering in the east. But first, he would need to find a way into that fortress of shadow, past whatever guards and wards the necromancer had set to protect his dwelling. And as if in response to his thoughts, the green light blazed up again, brighter than before, and from the tower came a sound like laughter, cold and mocking, and filled with the promise of pain beyond mortal endurance. The necromancer knew he had come. The trap was set, and the bait was dangling before him like a golden fruit upon a poisoned branch. All that remained was to see whether Gandalf the Grey had the courage to take that final step into the heart of darkness itself. The approach to Dol Guldur was a journey through the geography of nightmare. As Gandalf stepped from the dying forest onto the blasted heath that surrounded the fortress, each footfall seemed to echo in the silence like the tolling of a funeral bell. The ground beneath his feet was not earth as wholesome folk would know it, but a grey ash that had once been stone and soil, corrupted by long exposure to the malice that dwelt within the tower. No path led to the gates of that accursed place, for what need had the necromancer of roads when his servants came on wings of shadow or crept through ways beneath the earth? Yet as Gandalf drew closer to the hill of black stone, passages revealed themselves, not built by any hand, but worn by the passage of things that should not walk under sun or star. These tracks ran like scars across the poisoned ground, and where they passed, even the hardy thorns that grew in that wasteland withered and died. The gates of Dol Guldur were wrought of black iron bound with spells, of such malevolence that the very air around them shimmered with heat, though no fire burned there save the cold flame of hatred itself. They stood open, a sight that filled Gandalf with deeper unease than if they had been barred against him. For this was invitation and challenge combined, the arrogance of one who feared no assault from the forces of light. Above the gates, carved in letters that burned with their own sick radiance, were words in the black speech that spoke of dominion over all living things, of the binding of the free peoples in chains of servitude, and of the return of the shadow to claim what it deemed its own. Gandalf did not speak those words aloud, for even to voice them would have been to give them power, but he understood their meaning all too well. As he passed beneath the arch of the gateway, a cold wind rose from nowhere, carrying with it the stench of charnel houses and the whispered promises of despair. His staff blazed with white fire, pushing back the creeping shadows that sought to wrap themselves around him like living shrouds, and his voice rang out in the clear tongue of Valinor, speaking words of protection and defiance. The courtyard beyond the gates was vast and empty, paved with stones that had been black even before the shadow touched them. Here and there stood pillars of the same dark rock, carved with figures that seemed to writhe and shift when seen from the corner of the eye. Fountains that had once run with clear water now held only pools of brackish liquid that reflected no light, and from their depths came sounds like the weeping of lost souls. At the courtyard's heart rose the tower itself, its base so broad that 50 men walking abreast could not have spanned it, its height so great that its crown was lost in the perpetual gloom that hung over that accursed place. No windows pierced its lower walls, no doors offered entrance to mortal feet. But as Gandalf approached, his keen eyes caught sight of a narrow stair that wound around the tower's exterior, carved directly into the living rock and worn smooth by the passage of countless years. The voice he had heard, that cry in the Eldarin tongue, came again as he set foot upon the stair, fainter now, but touched with a note of desperate hope. Someone within that tower knew of his coming, someone who still possessed enough of their true nature to call out in the language of the firstborn. And in that voice, Gandalf heard an echo of nobility and wisdom that reminded him of the great kings of old, of the line of Gil-galad and the majesty of the Eldar in their glory. The stair was treacherous, slick with moisture that might have been dew if dew could fall in such a place, but which had the consistency and smell of something far fouler. With each step upward, the weight of malice pressed heavier upon his shoulders, and visions flashed before his eyes, images of defeat and despair, of all his works brought to ruin, and the free peoples ground beneath the heel of tyranny. But Gandalf had walked in shadow before, had faced the Balrogs in the depths of the earth, and stood unmoved before the wrath of Morgoth himself. These phantoms, terrible though they were, could not turn him from his purpose. Higher and higher he climbed, his staff casting its circle of clean light in the oppressive gloom, until at last he came to a window cut deep into the tower's wall. Beyond the window lay a chamber that might once have been fair, for its walls were carved with images of stars and growing things, and its floor was paved with stones that held within them the memory of moonlight. But now, those carvings were defaced with runes of binding and torment, and the stones were stained with substances best left unnamed. In the chamber's center hung a cage of black iron, and within that cage, Gandalf's heart leaped with recognition and grief, for the prisoner was indeed one of the mighty among the Eldar. Tall he was, though bent with suffering, and fair despite the marks of long torment. His hair, once golden as the light of Lorelei, hung lank and dim about his shoulders, and his grey eyes held depths of pain that spoke of horrors beyond mortal comprehension. Yet still there was majesty in his bearing, and when he raised his head at Gandalf's approach, the light of the undying lands flickered briefly in his gaze. "Thrain," whispered Gandalf, for he knew now who it was that hung in chains within that chamber of torment. Not one of the Eldar as he had hoped, but Thrain's son of Thror, king under the mountain, who had vanished years ago while seeking to reclaim his people's ancient wealth. But something was wrong. The voice that had called out in Elvish, Thrain bore no love for the Eldar and knew little of their tongue. And as Gandalf looked more closely at the figure in the cage, he saw that the prisoner's lips were sealed with some foul enchantment, and that the voice came from elsewhere, from deeper in the tower, where an even greater horror awaited. The trap was springing closed around him, and the bait had been revealed for what it truly was. Not rescue, but the promise of something far more dangerous. Yet Gandalf could not turn back now, not with Thrain hanging in torment before his eyes, not with that other voice still calling from the depths of the tower. Whatever waited for him in the darkness above, he would face it as he had faced all the servants of shadow, with courage in his heart and the flame of Anor burning bright upon his staff. The window was narrow, meant perhaps for an archer's use in days when the tower had served a different master, but Gandalf passed through it like smoke, his grey robes seeming to fold and shift as he moved. The chamber beyond was larger than it had appeared from without, its walls stretching up into shadows that his starlight could not penetrate. The air was thick with the reek of despair and something else, a sweet, cloying scent, like flowers left too long in a tomb. Thrain stirred in his iron cage as Gandalf approached, his chains clinking with a sound like distant bells. The Dwarf King's clothes, once rich with gold and gems befitting his station, hung in tatters about his wasted frame. His beard, the pride of his people, was matted and grey with filth, and his hands, those hands that had once held the scepter of Erebor, were raw with the marks of long captivity. Who comes to mock Thrain's son of Thror in his torment? The voice was cracked and dry, like autumn leaves crushed underfoot, but still carried the deep tones of mountain speech. Have you not sport enough with shadows and whispers? Must you wear the shape of the grey fool to torment me further? Gandalf's heart clenched with pity and rage. I am no phantom, Thrain King. I am Gandalf, whom some call the Grey Wanderer, and I have come far to find you. Long have the dwarves of the Blue Mountains mourned your passing, and your son Thror is dead. The words came out as a shriek of anguish that echoed from the stone walls like the cry of a wounded beast. Dead by the hand of Azog the Defiler, his head struck from his shoulders in the gates of Moria. Do not speak to me of my son, Grey Fool, for I have seen his fate in visions more terrible than any dream. But Gandalf stepped closer, and the light of his staff fell full upon the Dwarf King's face. Nay, Thrain, it was your father Thror who fell in Moria, not your son. Your mind has been clouded by the torments of this place, but I speak truth. Thror lives and rules the dwarves in exile. He searches still for some sign of his father's fate. For a moment, clarity flickered in Thrain's eyes like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. His head lifted, and something of his old majesty shone through the marks of suffering. Thror, my son lives? But no, it cannot be. I have been here so long, so very long. Time has no meaning in this place of shadow. The seasons turn, the years pass, but here there is only the eternal now of pain and the whispers that never cease. How long, Thrain? How long have you been prisoner in this accursed place? The Dwarf King laughed, a sound like breaking glass. How long? I came seeking the ring of my fathers, the ring that was Thror's and his father's before him. 7 years, 70, 700. The numbers run together like water through my fingers. But I remember the day I left the Blue Mountains. Remember the hope that burned in my heart. Such a fool I was to think I could reclaim what was lost. Gandalf felt a chill deeper than the cold air of the chamber. The ring, one of the 7 given to the dwarf lords in the elder days, and long thought lost when Smaug took the mountain. But if Thrain had come seeking it, if the necromancer held it now, the ring, Thrain, tell me of the ring. Does the master of this place possess it? Thrain's eyes grew wide with terror, and he pressed himself back against the bars of his cage, as if trying to escape some unseen horror. Do not speak of it. Do not even think of it. He has ways of knowing, ways of seeing into the secret places of the heart. The ring, yes, he has it. He has had it for so long, and through it he has worked such evil as would make the stones weep. Through it he speaks to the other rings, calls to them across the leagues, gathers their power to himself like a spider drawing in its web. The implications struck Gandalf like a physical blow. If the necromancer could indeed communicate with the other rings of power through Thrain's ring, if he could influence their bearers or track their movements. But there was more. In Thrain's ravings, he heard echoes of a greater horror. The voice that calls in Elvish, Gandalf said quietly. It is not yours. Who else is prisoner here? Thrain shuddered, his chains rattling. Above, in the highest chamber, But you must not go there, Grey Wanderer. Whatever mercy brought you to this cursed place, do not throw your life away in vain. He waits for you, has been waiting since first you set foot upon the road to this place. Everything, my capture, my torment, even my survival, all has been arranged to bring you here, to this moment, to this choice. Who waits, Thrain? Speak plainly, for time grows short and the shadows deepen. The Dwarf King's voice dropped to a whisper, so faint that Gandalf had to lean close to hear it. The necromancer is no mere sorcerer, no petty lord of ghosts and shadows. I have heard his true voice when he thought me senseless with pain, heard him speak in the black tongue to servants that come from the east. He is the shadow that fell upon Númenor, the deceiver who corrupted the rings. The Dark Lord himself returned to power. The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of understanding through Gandalf's mind. Sauron, the enemy, had returned, not in his ancient fortress of Barad-dûr, but here in this tower of sorcery, gathering his strength in secret while the wise slept and the free peoples went about their daily lives in ignorance of the doom that prepared itself in darkness. And the voice above, Gandalf pressed, though his heart already knew the answer. Celebrimbor, Thrain whispered, the name falling from his lips like a curse. Lord of Eregion, maker of the Rings of Power, he has been prisoner here longer than I, held in torment to force from him the secrets of his craft. Through him, the Dark Lord seeks to complete what he began in the Elder Days, the dominion of all the rings, the binding of all free wills to his own. Gandalf stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of this knowledge settling upon his shoulders like a mountain. Sauron returned, Celebrimbor captive, the Rings of Power compromised. The scope of the trap was far greater than he had imagined, and at its center sat the one enemy that all the powers of Middle-earth had once united to defeat. Yet still the elvish voice called from above. Still there was hope of rescue for two who had suffered long in darkness, and perhaps in their salvation lay the key to warning the free peoples of the doom that gathered against them. I must go up, Gandalf said at last. Whatever the cost, whatever the risk, I cannot leave you both to this torment. Thrain reached through the bars of his cage, his fingers clutching at the grey wizard's robes. Then you go to your death, and all hope dies with you. Better that two suffer in darkness than that the light itself be extinguished. But Gandalf gently freed himself from the Dwarf King's grasp. That choice is not ours to make, old friend. We do what we must, and trust that wisdom greater than our own will guide the outcome. But first, the wizard spoke a word of power, and the lock of Thrain's cage sprang open with a sound like singing steel. The chains that bound the Dwarf King's wrists crumbled to rust at a gesture, and for the first time in years beyond counting, Thrain stood free. Go, Gandalf commanded. Find the stairs. Flee this accursed place while darkness still covers your escape. Make your way to the Lonely Mountain if you can, or to any haven where the light still dwells. Warn them of what you have learned here, and bid them prepare for war. Thrain stood swaying on his feet, freedom so long denied, now seeming like another cruel dream. But slowly, understanding dawned in his eyes, and with it came a glimpse of the king he had once been. And you, Grey Wanderer. Gandalf was already moving toward the stair that led upward into greater darkness. I have one more prisoner to free and a Dark Lord to face. Pray that I prove equal to the task. The stair that wound upward from Thrain's chamber was carved from the living rock of the tower, each step worn smooth by the passage of feet that should never have walked upon stone, blessed by starlight. As Gandalf climbed, the very air grew thick and viscous, clinging to his robes like cobwebs spun from shadow and malice. His staff cast its circle of white fire before him, but the light seemed diminished here, as if the darkness possessed weight enough to press against it and force it back. Higher he climbed, and with each step the whispers grew stronger. They came not from any mortal throat, but from the stones themselves, from the very foundations of the tower that had been raised by will alone and bound together with words of power spoken in the black tongue. The whispers spoke of defeat, of the futility of hope, of the small light that struggled so vainly against the eternal night that was the birthright of all creation. Gandalf Greyheim, came a voice from above, soft as silk and cold as winter starlight. How long I have waited for this moment. How long I have prepared for your coming. The grey wizard paused upon the stair, his weathered hand tightening upon his staff. He had heard that voice before, in the depths of time when the world was younger and the war against the shadow had raged across the breadth of Middle-earth. But then it had spoken from a form of beauty and terrible majesty, crowned with gold and robed in light that had become corruption. Now it came from darkness made manifest, from will without form, save what malice chose to wear. I know you, Sauron the Deceiver, Gandalf called up into the gloom, his voice ringing clear despite the oppressive weight of evil that pressed down upon him. I knew you when you were called Myron the Admirable, before pride and the hunger for dominion led you to kneel before Morgoth the Black. What form do you wear now in your exile from the light? Laughter echoed down the stair, neither wholly of this world nor entirely of the void beyond it. Form, dear Gandalf. I am become something far greater than form. I am will made manifest, desire given substance, the pure essence of power unbound by the petty constraints of flesh. But come up to my chamber, and see what your old adversary has become in the long years of waiting. Against every instinct that screamed for him to flee, Gandalf continued his ascent. The stair grew steeper, the steps more treacherous, and the whispers louder until they seemed to come from his own thoughts, his own doubts made audible. But still he climbed, for above him the voice of Celebrimbor called out in the pure tongue of Valinor, speaking words of making and unmaking that had not been heard in Middle-earth since the fall of Eregion. At last, the stair ended in a doorway wrought of black iron and bound with chains forged in the fires of Mount Doom. The door stood open, for what need had the master of this place for barriers when his will alone was sufficient to hold all the world at bay? Beyond the threshold lay a chamber vast as a cathedral, its walls rising into shadows that no light could penetrate, its floor a mirror of polished obsidian that reflected not the present, but visions of futures dark and terrible. In the chamber's heart hung a cage of mithril and gold, beautiful and terrible to behold, for it had been wrought with all the skill of the Eldar and twisted to purposes of torment. Within that cage, suspended by chains that sang with their own malevolent music, hung the form of Celebrimbor, Lord of Eregion. Fair he was still, despite the marks of long torment, his dark hair flowing about his shoulders like water in moonlight, his grey eyes holding depths of wisdom and pain that spoke of knowledge bought at a price too terrible to name. Upon his brow was a circlet of silver, cracked and tarnished, but still beautiful, for it had been made in the days when the craft of the Eldar was at its height, and every work of their hands was touched with the light of the undying lands. But it was not Celebrimbor that held Gandalf's gaze, but the presence that filled the chamber like smoke from some vast and distant fire. It had no fixed form, this thing that had once been called Sauron, but shifted and flowed like liquid shadow, given consciousness and will. Sometimes it seemed to wear the shape of a great eye wreathed in flame, sometimes that of a figure tall and terrible, crowned with darkness. But always, always, there was the sense of vast intelligence turned wholly to evil ends, of power that had once served the music of creation, now bent to its discord and ruin. Behold, the voice spoke from everywhere and nowhere, the last of the ringsmiths, the keeper of secrets that I have spent long ages wresting from his stubborn will. Through him, I have learned much of the rings making, of the words of binding that hold them to their purpose, of the flaws in their crafting that might be turned to my advantage. Celebrimbor raised his head at Gandalf's approach, and in his eyes flickered recognition and something that might have been hope. "Mithrandir," he whispered, his voice like the sound of wind through silver leaves. "You should not have come to this place. The trap is deeper than you know, the web more intricate than even your wisdom can unravel." "Peace, old friend," Gandalf replied, though his gaze never left the shifting shadow that was Sauron. "I have not come so far to leave empty-handed, but first, let us speak of present matters." He raised his staff, and white fire blazed from its tip, casting the chamber into sharp relief and forcing the shadows back. "Show yourself, Sauron. If you would parley with me, do so in a form that does not mock the very air with its presence." The laughter came again, but this time there was anger beneath it, and the temperature in the chamber dropped until Gandalf's breath misted before him. "Very well, Gandalf the Grey. If it is forms you wish to see, then behold what your defiance has wrought." The shadows coalesced, drawing together like smoke pulled by an unseen wind, and from them stepped a figure that was terrible to look upon. Tall it was, taller than mortal men, robed in darkness that seemed to drink light itself. Its face was hidden beneath a crown of black iron, but from the shadow of that crown gleamed two eyes like stars fallen into the void, burning with malice and ancient hatred. But it was the hands that drew Gandalf's gaze, for upon one finger gleamed a ring of gold, simple in appearance, but holding within its circle such power as had not been seen since the elder days. It was not the one ring that lay still hidden and unfound, but one of the 7 given to the dwarf lords, taken from Thrain in his captivity and bent now to purposes far darker than its makers had ever intended. "Thus I stand before you," Sauron spoke, his voice like the rumble of distant thunder. "Not as I was in the days of my glory, when I walked in light and all Middle-earth trembled at my passing, but as I am now, essence distilled, purpose refined, will made absolute. I am become what I was always meant to be, Gandalf Stormcrow. I am the ending of all songs, the silence that follows the last note, the darkness that remains when all lights have failed." Gandalf stood unmoved before this terrible figure that was Sauron reborn, his grey robes stirring in a wind that came from no earthly source. The white fire of his staff burned brighter in response to the Dark Lord's presence, and when he spoke, His words carried the authority of one who had walked in the blessed realm beyond the circles of the world. "You speak of endings, Sauron Gorthor," the grey wizard said, his voice steady as stone despite the malice that pressed upon him from all sides. "But you mistake silence for victory, darkness for dominion. You are not the ending of songs. You are the discord that makes harmony more precious, the shadow that gives meaning to light. You were not made for destruction, but for creation, and that truth burns within you still, though you deny it with every breath." The Dark Lord's laughter was like the sound of breaking glass, sharp and cutting. "Creation? I have created much, old fool. I have created fear where there was courage, despair where there was hope, hatred where there was love. I have remade the very foundations of this world according to my will, and soon all who draw breath shall acknowledge my dominion." "Words," Gandalf replied, and now his staff blazed so bright that the shadows fled to the corners of the chamber like living things seeking shelter. Empty words spoken by one diminished. "You speak of dominion, yet you cower in this tower of shadow, hiding from the light like a spider in its web. You speak of remaking the world, yet you must steal the works of others, the rings of Celebrimbor, the throne of Númenor, the very stones of this fortress built by hands greater than your own." The temperature in the chamber plummeted, and frost began to form upon the walls. Sauron's eyes blazed with fury, and his voice, when he spoke, was like the hiss of molten metal quenched in ice. "You dare speak to me of diminishment? I, who held the kings of Númenor in thrall? I, who commanded the allegiance of 9 kings of men and made them my servants for all eternity. I, who forged in secret the one ring that shall bind all others to my will." But even as the words left his lips, Sauron seemed to realize he had spoken too much. The revelation hung in the air between them like a sword blade catching light, and Gandalf's eyes widened with understanding and horror. "The One Ring," the grey wizard whispered. "You have made it already. The Master Ring that Celebrimbor spoke of in his letters to Gil-galad. It exists, and through it you would command all the others. But where is it, Sauron? If you possess such power, why do you not wield it openly?" The Dark Lord's form wavered like smoke in wind, and for a moment his terrible composure cracked. "Lost," he hissed, the word torn from him as if by torture. "Lost in the waters of Anduin when the last alliance broke my physical form. But not lost forever, Gandalf the Grey. Even now it calls to me across the leagues, and I to it. Soon, very soon, it shall return to my hand, and then shall all your brave words avail you nothing." Celebrimbor stirred in his cage of mithril and gold, his voice rising in a chant that was both prayer and invocation. "Elbereth Gilthoniel," he sang, the ancient words of calling upon the Star-Kindler. "O Menel Palandiriel, Nachered Palandiriel, O Galadremin Enorath." "Silence," Sauron roared, and his hand gestured sharply toward the suspended cage. Lightning leapt from his fingers, black as midnight and cold as the void between stars, striking the elven lord and tearing a cry of agony from his lips. The chains that held him sang with discordant music, and the mithril bars of his prison glowed with heat that was somehow frozen fire. "Enough!" Gandalf stepped forward, his staff blazing like a star, and spoke a word that had not been heard in Middle-earth since the Elder Days, a word of unmaking, of the sundering of bonds, of the freeing of all things held against their will. "Ash Nazg Gimbatul," he cried, turning the Dark Lord's own words against him. "By this ring you sought to bind all things. But I speak now the word of unbinding. Let what is chained be free. Let what is bound be loosed. Let the will that would enslave be itself made captive. The words struck Sauron like a physical blow, sending him staggering backward. The ring upon his finger blazed with sudden fire, but it was not the golden flame of dominion. It was silver fire, the fire of freedom, the light that could not be quenched or commanded. For a moment, the Dark Lord's form became translucent, and through it could be seen the chamber beyond, empty and echoing. "Impossible," Sauron whispered, his voice filled with something that might have been fear. The word of unmaking, that knowledge was sealed, hidden in the depths of Valinor where no shadow can reach. How do you... "I am more than you know, Sauron the Deceiver," Gandalf replied. And now his grey robes seemed to shimmer with inner light, as if woven from starlight itself. "I am Gandalf, called Mithrandir in the ancient tongue, Olorin, that was my name in the West. I am one of the Maiar, as you were once, before pride and the lust for power led you into darkness. And I tell you now that your dominion shall not come to pass, not while courage burns in the hearts of the free peoples, not while light endures to stand against shadow." The revelation struck both Sauron and Celebrimbor like thunder. The Elven Lord raised his head, hope kindling in his grey eyes like stars emerging from behind clouds. But Sauron's reaction was fury beyond mortal comprehension, the rage of the fallen angel who discovers that heaven has not forgotten him, that mercy still exists even for such as he. "Olorin," he shrieked, and his form blazed up like a dark flame. The grey wanderer, the meddler, the tender of small flames and keeper of petty hopes. You think your revelation changes anything? You are still bound by the same laws that bind me, still constrained by the will of the one who set you upon this path. And I am free to work my will upon this world, free to remake it in my own image, free to hide in shadows and work through proxies and servants," Gandalf interrupted, his voice cutting through Sauron's tirade like a blade through silk. "To skulk in ruined towers and torment prisoners for secrets you cannot discover on your own. To rage and threaten while your enemies walk in sunlight and sing songs of joy. Tell me, Sauron, which of us seems the more free?" The Dark Lord's answering roar shook the very foundations of the tower, and the battle of wills that had simmered beneath their words finally blazed into open conflict. Power met power in the high chamber of Dol Guldur, the white fire of Gandalf's staff against the black lightning of Sauron's wrath, the word of freedom against the chains of tyranny, the flame imperishable against the darkness that sought to quench all light. And in that moment of conflict, as the two Maiars strove against each other with power that could reshape mountains and redirect rivers, the cage that held Celebrimbor cracked like an egg, and the Elven Lord fell free to the obsidian floor of the chamber, his chains crumbling to dust at the touch of air untainted by malice. The escape from Dol Guldur was not the flight of heroes triumphant, but the desperate retreat of one who had gazed too deeply into the abyss and found it gazing back. Gandalf bore Celebrimbor in his arms, the Elven Lord weakened by long torment until he was light as a bird, his fair form diminished, but his spirit unbroken. Behind them, the tower shook with Sauron's rage, and the very stones seemed to weep with fury at their departure. They found Thrain at the forest's edge, standing like a man carved from stone, as he gazed back at the fortress where he had spent so many years in darkness. The Dwarf King's eyes were clearer now, freed from the immediate oppression of Sauron's will, but they held depths of memory that would never fully heal. "Is it done?" Thrain asked as Gandalf approached, his voice hoarse from long disuse of hope. "It is begun," the Grey Wizard replied, settling Celebrimbor gently against the trunk of an oak that still remembered cleaner days. The necromancer's true name is spoken, his presence revealed, his power shown to have limits. But the greater work lies ahead. Celebrimbor stirred, his grey eyes opening to regard his rescuers with something approaching wonder. When he spoke, his voice carried the music of Valinor, though it was frayed now like a harp with broken strings. "Mithrandir, son of the West, long have I waited for word from beyond the circles of the world. Tell me, do the ships still sail from the grey havens? Does the light of Eärendil still shine upon the western waters?" "They do, and it does," Gandalf answered gently. "The way west remains open for those who have earned the right to take it. But first, we must see that Middle-earth endures long enough for that choice to matter. The journey to Rivendell took 20 days, for they could not travel swiftly with Celebrimbor in his weakened state, and Thrain bore wounds of the spirit that made every step a labor. They followed hidden ways through the wild lands, paths known only to the rangers and those few who still remembered the elder days. But even on these secret roads, Gandalf felt the weight of watching eyes, the sense that Sauron's malice pursued them across the leagues like a hunting hound following a scent. On the 7th day, as they sheltered in a grove of Malorn trees that had somehow taken root far from their home in Lothlorien, Celebrimbor spoke of what he had endured in the High Tower. "He sought to break more than my body," the Elven Lord said, his fingers tracing patterns in the air that glowed briefly with silver light before fading. "The secrets of the ring's making. That was his true goal. He would have me speak the words of command that bind each ring to its purpose, reveal the flaws in their crafting that might allow him to corrupt their power. But the three, Vilya, Narya, and Nenya, these he could not touch, for they were wrought in secret and never knew his hand." "The three are hidden still?" Gandalf asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Hidden and protected by those who understand their worth. Vilya rests with Gil-galad, mightiest of elven rings and dearest to my heart. Narya I gave to Círdan the shipwright, for he sees farthest into the mists of time. And Nenya," Celebrimbor's voice grew soft as wind through leaves, "Nenya I sent to the Lady of the Golden Wood, for in her wisdom lies the preservation of all fair things that might otherwise fade from the world." Thrain, who had been silent throughout their journey, save for necessary words, suddenly spoke. "The 7 that were given to my people, all are lost or destroyed save one, the ring of Thror's house, which that accursed sorcerer stole from me. Through it, he spoke to dragons in their caves, called to the gold sickness that lies in dwarvish hearts, stirred the greed that has been our bane since first we delved in darkness." Gandalf nodded grimly. "And the 9 that were given to mortal men, these have long since claimed their bearers, making of them the Nazgul, the ringwraiths who are neither living nor dead but slaves to Sauron's will. They sleep now in their tombs of iron, but when their master calls, they will ride forth to spread terror across the lands of the free." On the 12th day, they were met by a company of elves from Rivendell, led by Eristor the Counselor and Glorfindel the Golden-Haired. These lords had ridden hard from the hidden valley, for word of Gandalf's mission had reached Elrond through ways known only to the wise, and the Lord of Rivendell feared what tidings the Grey Wizard might bring. "Mithrandir," Glorfindel called, as his white horse crested the hill where the travellers rested. "Well met in the wild lands, though I fear the shadow that follows in. Your wake, Lord Elrond, awaits your coming with great urgency, for ill dreams have troubled his sleep, and the mirror of Galadriel has shown waters dark with prophecy." They rode the remaining leagues to Rivendell in companionable silence, but it was the silence of those who carry weighty news and know that words, once spoken, cannot be unsaid. The valley, when it appeared before them like a green jewel set in the crown of the mountains, seemed somehow smaller than before, more precious and more fragile, as if the very knowledge of Sauron's return had diminished the light that dwelt there. Elrond met them at the gates of his house, and with him stood Saruman the White, whose presence spoke of the gravity of the hour. The head of the White Council wore robes that seemed woven from starlight itself, and his eyes held depths of knowledge gathered through long study of the enemy's ways. But there was something in his bearing that troubled Gandalf, a tension, a coiled eagerness that spoke of purposes held in check. "Gandalf," Elrond said, his voice heavy with foreboding, "what news do you bring from the shadow? And who are these companions that bear upon them the marks of Dol Guldur's malice?" "Grave news indeed," Gandalf replied, dismounting from the horse that had borne him the final leagues to safety. "The necromancer is revealed, and he is more terrible than our worst fears imagined. But let us speak of these matters in council, for what I have learned concerns all the free peoples, and the wise must take counsel together ere the shadows grow longer." That night, in the high chamber where the White Council was wont to meet, Gandalf spoke at length of all he had seen and heard in the Dark Tower. He told of Thrain's captivity and the theft of the Ring of Power. He spoke of Celebrimbor's long torment and the secrets that Sauron had sought to wrest from him. And finally, with words heavy as stones, he revealed the necromancer's true identity and the existence of the One Ring that had been lost in the waters of Anduin. When he finished, silence fell over the council like a shroud. It was Saruman who spoke first, his voice carefully controlled, but carrying an undercurrent of something that might have been excitement. "The One Ring," he said slowly, as if tasting the words. "So our ancient enemy has indeed returned, and his master weapon exists still. This changes much, Gandalf. The very foundations of our strategy must be reconsidered." "Indeed they must," Elrond agreed, his grey eyes troubled. "For if the ring should return to Sauron's hand, all our works will come to naught, and darkness will cover the world like a tide that cannot be turned." But Gandalf, watching Saruman's face in the flickering candlelight, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. For in the White Wizard's eyes, he thought he glimpsed something that troubled him more than Sauron's threats, the gleam of one who saw opportunity where others saw disaster, who looked upon the revelation of the One Ring not as a warning, but as a prize to be won. The winds of change blew cold across the northern waters as Ar-Pharazôn gazed upon his mighty fleet. 25 years had passed since he had taken the scepter from his aged kinsman, and in that time Númenor's power had grown beyond all measure. The golden ships stretched to the horizon, their banners snapping in the salt breeze like the wings of great eagles. "My lord," spoke Gimmelzor, his chief counselor, "the men of Middle-earth bow before your name from Harad to the Grey Havens. Yet still there is one who defies you." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Sauron holds fast in Mordor, and his shadow grows longer with each passing season. The king's eyes, once bright with the light of Númenor's glory, now burned with a different fire. The Palantir in his private chamber had shown him visions that fed his pride and stirred his wrath. In dreams, he walked halls of gold that made even Armanelos seem poor, and wore crowns that dimmed the light of stars. Let him come, Ar-Pharazôn declared, his voice carrying across the harbor. Let this Sauron face the might of Númenor and learn what it means to challenge the lords of the sea. The courtiers murmured approval, but some among the faithful felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn wind. In distant Andunia, Amandil tended his garden and felt the earth tremble beneath his feet. The white tree in his courtyard, grown from a fruit of Nimloth before its burning, seemed to weep silver tears in the fading light. Change was coming on wings of storm and shadow. Far from the proud harbors of Númenor, in the green lands that would one day know the laughter of hobbits, an old shepherd watched his flocks beneath the wheeling stars. The grass grew sweet in those days, and the streams ran clear and cold from the mountains. Yet even here, in this forgotten corner of Middle-earth, the shadow was felt. The man's name was Bregan, and he was of the line of those who had remained faithful to the old ways when many of his kinfolk sailed west to receive their reward. His fathers had walked these hills since the elder days, keeping the ancient watch, tending the sacred groves where the Ents still wandered in the deep places of the wood. On this night, as the stars wheeled overhead in their slow dance, Bregon felt a stirring in the earth. The sheep grew restless, huddling close to the folds, and even the great hounds lifted their heads to sniff the air. Something was changing in the music of the world, a discord creeping into the harmony that had held since the shaping of Arda. "The straight road grows dim," he murmured to his eldest son, who had come to share the night watch. "The light fails in the west, and the shadow lengthens in the east. Dark days are coming, darker than any we have known." His son, young and eager, laughed softly. "Old tales, father. The world is wide and we are small. What harm can touch us here in our green valleys?" But even as he spoke, a cloud passed across the face of the moon, and the night grew chill. In the depths of Fangorn, Treebeard stirred in his ancient dream and spoke words in the old tongue that few now remembered. The very stones seemed to listen, and far away, in halls of malice under shadow, other ears caught the echo of that speech and grew troubled. The great ships of Númenor cut through the waves like blades through silk, their golden prows casting spray that caught the sunlight like scattered diamonds. Ar-Pharazôn stood upon the deck of his flagship, the Alcarondas, and felt the thrill of conquest singing in his veins. Behind him sailed the greatest armament that had ever been gathered upon the waters of the world. Sauron had sent his embassy, as the king had known he would. The Dark Lord's servants had come bearing gifts and smooth words, speaking of alliance and shared dominion over Middle-earth. But Ar-Pharazôn was not deceived. He would bring this upstart sorcerer to heel, drag him in chains to Armanelos, and make him serve the throne of Númenor. "The wind favors us, my lord," called the shipmaster, his weathered face bright with pride. "At this pace, we shall reach the shores of Middle-earth within the week. The king nodded, his gaze fixed upon the eastern horizon, where storm clouds gathered like a dark army. In the depths of Mordor, Sauron felt their coming and smiled. The trap was sprung at last, though not as the king of Númenor believed. For 50 years, the Dark Lord had worked in shadow, whispering poison into proud ears, feeding the hunger for dominion that grew in the hearts of men. Now the greatest of mortal kingdoms came sailing to their doom, and they brought it willingly. The Nazgul stirred in their tower of Minas Morgul, feeling their master's pleasure like wine in their veins. Soon the straight road would be broken, the ban of the Valar challenged, and the world remade according to the will of Sauron. The king of Númenor would indeed claim a throne eternal, but not the one he sought. Thunder rolled across the island kingdom as Ar-Pharazôn returned in triumph, and with him came the prisoner who was no prisoner. Sauron walked the marble halls of Armanelos in the fair form he had taken, seeming to all who beheld him as a lord of great wisdom and power. His words were honeyed, his counsel subtle, and his gifts beyond price. "My lord king," the deceiver spoke in the council chamber, his voice like music wrought of gold. "Why should the lords of the sea content themselves with dominion over the waves alone? Westward lies a realm of eternal spring, where death holds no sway and time moves not. The Valar have hoarded these gifts too long." The courtiers murmured in agreement, their eyes bright with avarice. Only the faithful remained silent, and their silence was marked by those who now ruled in the king's name. Amandil felt the weight of watching eyes and knew that the days of his house were numbered. In the court of the fountain, where once the white tree had bloomed in silver glory, now stood an altar of black stone. Upon it burned fires that gave no warmth, and the smoke that rose from those flames carried whispers in the black speech. The king's guard, once proud in silver mail, now wore helms wrought in the fashion of Mordor, and their hearts had grown as dark as their new allegiance. Yet still, there were those who remembered the light. In hidden chambers, the faithful gathered to sing the old songs and keep alive the flame of hope. Elendil walked among them like a tall tree in a darkening wood, and his sons Isildur and Anarion stood ready to follow where their father led. The fruit of Nimloth the Fair was hidden away, and ships prepared in secret harbours. For the wise among the Dunedain could read the signs, and they knew that the end was upon them. The world would be changed, and they would have their part in the changing. In the armories beneath Armanelos, smiths worked through the nights by the light of red forges, crafting weapons for a war that mortal men were never meant to fight. The sound of hammers rang like funeral bells, and the steel they shaped held a darkness that would not be cleansed by any blessing. Ar-Pharazôn stood before the great map of Arda that adorned his throne room, studying the western reaches where the undying lands lay hidden behind the veils of the world. His mind, once noble, now twisted by pride and the whispers of his counselor, conceived plans that would shake the very foundations of creation. "The time draws near, my king," Sauron murmured at his elbow, the fair mask he wore seeming to shine with inner light. "Your fleet grows mighty, your people burn with righteous desire for what has been denied them. Why should the children of Ilúvatar be barred from the inheritance that is rightfully theirs?" The king's hand closed upon the hilt of his sword, Aranruth, blade of the kings of Númenor since the day of its founding. The steel had been wrought in Gondolin, blessed by elven smiths in the elder days, but now it seemed heavy in his grasp, and its light was dimmed. In the Tower of Avalona, upon the Isle of Erisea, Elrond felt the tremor in the music that spoke of approaching doom. The half-elven lord stood upon his balcony and gazed eastward across the wide waters, seeing in his mind's eye the golden island where his mortal kindred dwelt. His heart was heavy with foreknowledge, yet he could not prevent what was to come. Gil-galad too felt the wrongness in the wind, and in Lindon the trumpets sounded as the Eldar prepared for a sorrow greater than any since the fall of Gondolin. The ships of the faithful would need harbours, and the survivors would need hope in the darkness to come. The great assembly horn of Númenor sounded across the length and breadth of the island, its voice carrying from the Forest Star to the Hyana Star, calling all who owed allegiance to the sceptre to gather in the capital. From every haven and harbour, from mountain fastness and fertile vale, the people came at their king's summons. Armenelos had never seen such a gathering. The streets ran with gold and silver as lords vied to show their wealth, and the air rang with songs of triumph that would soon turn to lamentation. Yet beneath the pageantry, the wise could sense the approaching storm. The very earth trembled, and the stars seemed to flicker like candles in a rising wind. Ar-Pharazôn stood before his people in the court of the king, clad in mail of gold, and bearing upon his brow the crown of Númenor that had been wrought from metals brought from the depths of the earth. His voice rose above the multitude, strong and commanding, speaking words that would echo through the ages. Too long have we accepted the chains that bind us to these mortal shores. Too long have we bowed our heads before powers that deny us our birthright. We are the children of those who walked with the Valar in the elder days. Why should we not reclaim the inheritance that was taken from our fathers? The crowd roared approval, but in the sound was a note of madness, the same fever that had seized Ar-Pharazôn himself. Only among the faithful was there silence, and they began quietly to slip away, making ready for the journey that would save their remnant from the wrath to come. In his tower, Amandil watched the great ships gathering in the harbour and felt his heart break. The Valar had been patient, but patience had its limits. The world would be changed, and in the changing, much that was fair and noble would be lost forever. Yet still hope remained, carried in small ships toward the coasts of Middle-earth. While the madness of Númenor reached its height, in the shadows of Mordor, another plan took shape. Sauron had achieved more than even he had dared hope. The greatest kingdom of men would soon challenge the Valar themselves, and in their fall, the way would be cleared for his own dominion over Middle-earth. Yet the Dark Lord's triumph was not complete. In the fires of Mount Doom, he had wrought his masterpiece, the one ring that would bind all other rings of power to his will. But the ring remained hidden, its true nature known only to its maker. For Sauron wore it openly upon his hand, and few suspected that so small a thing could hold such power. The Nine had already fallen to his will, becoming wraiths that served him in shadow. The Seven burned in dragonfire or lay lost in the depths of the earth. But three remained free, the three rings of the elves, wrought in secret by Celebrimbor and never touched by the deceiver's hand. While they endured, there would yet be hope for the free peoples. Gil-galad wore Vilya, mightiest of the three, and its power helped to hold back the shadow from the realms of the Eldar. In Lothlorien, Galadriel bore Nenya, ring of water, and her land remained fair, despite the growing darkness. And in the Grey Havens, Círdan kept Narya, the red ring, waiting for one who would have greater need of its flame. The elven rings could not be mastered while Sauron wore the one, but neither could they be used to their full power. The stalemate held, but it would not endure forever. Soon the world would be changed utterly, and new choices would have to be made. In the depths of time, a small creature wandered through tunnels beneath the misty mountains, clutching a precious thing he had found in the darkness. But his time had not yet come, and the ring slept still, waiting for the hand that would awaken it to its destiny. The ships of Ar-Pharazôn covered the sea like a golden carpet stretching from horizon to horizon. Never before had such a fleet been gathered, and never again would mortal eyes behold its like. The king stood upon the prow of his flagship, his face set toward the west with terrible resolve. Behind them, Númenor burned, not with the fires of war, but with the fever of ambition that consumed her children. Those few who remained of the faithful huddled in hidden places or fled in small boats toward distant shores. The great kingdom that had been the gift of the Valar prepared to challenge the very powers that had raised it from the depths. Sauron stood beside his puppet king, and beneath his fair seeming, his spirit exulted. The trap was sprung at last, and the greatest enemies of his dominion sailed willingly to their doom. When the Valar moved to defend their realm, the world would be changed, the straight road broken, and Middle-earth would lie open to his conquest. Yet even as triumph seemed within his grasp, the Dark Lord felt a flicker of unease. The 3 elven rings still resisted his will, and in the Grey Havens, ships were being prepared. Some few of the Númenorians would escape the wrath to come, and they would remember. They would remember, and in their remembering, hope would be preserved. The waters beneath the fleet began to rise and fall in patterns that spoke of power stirring in the depths. The sky darkened, though no clouds were visible, and the stars seemed to withdraw their light. The Valar had been patient beyond the measure of mortal understanding, but patience had its end. In the undying lands, Manwë rose from his throne atop Taniqatil and lifted his eyes to where Eru Ilúvatar dwelt beyond the circles of the world. The fate of Númenor would soon be sealed, and with it, the Second Age would draw toward its close. Yet out of ending would come beginning, and the threads of the music would be rewoven in patterns not yet seen. The world broke like a great bell tolling its final note. Where the proud ships of Ar-Pharazôn had sailed in their madness, now only empty water reflected the stars. Númenor the Golden, the Isle of Kings, the land of gift, all had passed beneath the waves in a moment of wrath that shook the very foundations of Arda. The straight road was bent, and the way to the undying lands was removed from the circles of the world. No longer could mortal ships sail westward to find the blessed realm, for it lay now beyond the reach of any save the Eldar and those few who held the right of passage. Yet not all was lost. Upon the shores of Middle-earth, 9 ships touched land as the first light of dawn broke through the ash-filled sky. Elendil the Tall stood upon the beach and looked back toward the west, where only clouds of steam and darkness marked the place where his homeland had been. Et erelo endorena utulian, he spoke, his voice carrying across the waters. Out of the great sea to Middle-earth I am come. The words would be remembered, carved in stone and carried in song, for they marked not an ending, but a beginning. Behind him came his sons, Isildur and Anarion, bearing the treasures that had been saved from the ruin. A seedling of the White Tree, 7 Palantiri, and the broken sword of the kings. Small things, but in them lay the hope of restoration. In Linden, Gil-galad received the refugees with honor and sorrow. The Elven King knew that dark days lay ahead, for Sauron had survived the wreck of Númenor and would soon move openly to claim dominion over Middle-earth. But the last alliance would stand against him, and though the cost would be great, the darkness would not prevail. The Second Age was ending, but the Third would begin with hope. In the ashes of the proud kingdom, new realms would rise. Gondor and Arnor would guard the ancient wisdom, and the blood of Númenor would not fail until the world's end. Small hands would yet hold the fate of all, and the light of Arendil would shine again in the darkest hour. The music played on, though its themes were changed, and in the changing was the promise of renewal. For darkness passes and dawn comes again to those who wait in hope.